C.S. Lewis and Narnia. You might have liked it when you were younger, but when you got older, maybe you didn't like the Christian allegory, or maybe you didn't like that Susan Pevensie didn't get into Narnia Heaven because of lipstick and boys. Or maybe, if you didn't think that, maybe you've heard that argument. C.S. Lewis's treatment of Susan Pevensie has been criticized by such authors as Philip Pullman and JK Rowling. You may have heard of her. I'm going to investigate their claims, see if they have any merit. I'm going to take a deep dive into the text itself, look at some of the things that C.S. Lewis wrote. Does this critique that Susan Pevensie did not get into Narnia Heaven because of her love of lipstick and nylons, does that actually hold up? On this topic, there's not a lot of original arguments. There's a fair number of articles being written that kind of look like they're parroting other people's interpretations of the novel rather than looking at the novel itself. However, I'll look at JK Rowling and Philip Pullman because I do believe that they're giving their own opinion on the matter, and it's often those opinions that get parroted by other people. So this is the Time Magazine in 2005. And to be fair to J.K. Rowling, she didn't sit down to write an essay on the subject. She was asked an interview question and then gave the following answer. So first we find out she didn't know that she was writing fantasy until after she had written her first book, and then realized, oh hey, that's what I was doing. And didn't finish Lord of the Rings, hadn't even read all of C.S. Lewis's Narnia novels, which her books get compared to a lot. There's something about Lewis's sentimentality about children that gets on her nerves. Quote, "There comes a point where Susan, who was the older girl, is lost to Narnia because she becomes interested in lipstick. She becomes irreligious, basically because she found sex," Rowling says. "I have a big problem with that." So this is the heart of a lot of critiques. Susan found lipstick, she becomes interested in boys, and that's a bad thing according to C.S. Lewis. One thing to note here is she apparently has not read all of C.S. Lewis's Narnia novels. I don't know if that includes The Last Battle. So is this her interpretation, having fully read The Last Battle, or is she more recalling on what other people have said? I don't know, but we'll just assume that this is based on her own interpretation. But I can be quite confident that Philip Pullman has read the novels and is giving his own interpretation because he set out to write a anti-Narnia. So he at least has read this, and we can kind of see a similar critique. Again, a interview, so he didn't set out to write an essay. He is asked, hey, I hear you're not much of a fan of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. He goes on to talk about Tolkien a bit, and then he gets to C.S. Lewis. "I just don't like the conclusions Lewis comes to," this is Philip Pullman. "After all that analysis, the way he shuts children out of heaven, or whatever it is, on the grounds that one girl is interested in boys. She's a teenager. It's terrible. Sex can't have that. And yet I respect Lewis more than I do Tolkien." So again, there's that idea. Susan found boys. She became interested in boys, and that's what shuts her out of heaven. If you put those two together, what you basically see this argument that C.S. Lewis upholds a sort of arrested development for children, that they shouldn't grow up. It's a sort of Peter Pan effect. He has a thing against girls especially becoming interested in boys. So let's look at the original text, do a deep dive into that, do a close read, and see if this criticism holds up under scrutiny. This is found in The Last Battle, chapter 12. King Tyrion has been thrown into the stable where he meets the other children that entered into Narnia. He notices, hey, there's King Peter, there's King Edmund, and Queen Lucy. And then he says, "Sir, if I've read these chronicles aright, there should be another. Has not your majesty 2 sisters? Where is Queen Susan?" "My sister Susan," answered Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." "Yes," said Eustace, "and whenever you've tried to get her to come and talk about Narnia, or do anything about Narnia, she says, 'What wonderful memories you have. Fancy you still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children.'" Notice here, and this seems to get left out of a lot of these articles, this issue of faith or unbelief. She doesn't even believe that Narnia exists. She's passing it off as something that children would do, like invent whole worlds. I mean, that's the very thing they accused Lucy of in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We've gone full circle here. Except instead of Edmund, it's Susan that's denying that it ever happened. And that's the opening on she is no longer a friend of Narnia, followed by, yes, if we've ever tried to talk to her, she dismisses it as something that we made up. She does not even believe that Narnia, or at least she has managed to convince herself that Narnia does not exist. So then this is the part that gets blown up, right? So, oh, Susan, said Jill, she's interested in nothing nowadays except there's our nylons and lipstick and invitations. Notice boys are not mentioned. I suppose you could infer it. Though if we wanted to be pedantic, we could use a modern argument, which is lipstick and makeup isn't actually for men, but it's just for women to feel beautiful. There is that argument that's made. Therefore, there is no boys implied at all. But anyways, she's always a jolly sight too keen on being grown up. This is an argument that Jill is one of the youngest members of the group. She's a youngish girl, and so to her, Susan is older, and she's saying, oh, she's too grown up. That's the issue. But notice the follow-up, the response to the old woman of the group, Lady Polly, the elderly, if you will, statesman. You have the professor and you have Lady Polly. And she says, grown up indeed. I wish she would grow up. In other words, she isn't grown up. What Jill is saying is like, she's so grown up, and Polly is contradicting her. She is not actually grown up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. This is a criticism on the eternal youth, right? Like, we hear that all the time. We shouldn't be like lionizing the age 20-year-old or whatever. And this is what Susan is involved in. She was, as a teenager, trying to reach an age she was not, trying to dress up in something that she was not. And then when she's reached there, she's trying to maintain that eternal youth. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time of one's life as quick as she can, and then stop there as long as she can. Stop there as long as she can. This is what C.S. Lewis is arguing is a form of arrested development. It's not actual growing up. And then it goes on. Well, we don't want to talk about that now. The fruit trees. The nylons and the lipstick, it's kind of like red flags that people kind of like charging bull. But I don't think it's the true issue. These are signs, if you will, of the thing that she's trying to do, trying to look a certain age that she's not. I think we can get some more understanding of what's going on here if we look at one of C.S. Lewis's essays, because it talks a little bit about adulthood and growing up. This comes from the essay on 3 ways on writing for children. You can find it in the book on stories that has a bunch of his other essays. And the criticism is basically leveled that as a 50-year-old, it's a sign of arrested development if they're going about reading stories about dragons. There's something suspicious about that. And C.S. Lewis is countering that, and this is one of his critiques of that mentality, that fantasy is just for children. He says, critics who treat adults as a term of approval instead of merely a descriptive term cannot be adults themselves. To be concerned about growing up, to admire the grown-up because he is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these are the marks of childhood and adolescence. That sort of paranoia of, is this adult, is that adult, is a sign of adolescence, not being an adult. And in childhood and adolescence, they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to grow up. Again, contrary to this idea that C.S. Lewis is pro-arrested development, this sort of Peter Pan syndrome, C.S. Lewis is pro-children growing up. They ought to want to grow up. This is a healthy thing for children want to do. But to carry on into middle life or even into manhood, this concern about being an adult is a mark of really arrested development, that sort of hyperventilating. Am I an adult if I do this? Should I do this? Should I do that? That is a sign that a lacking maturity. That you're not confident in your sort of state of being. And it's a sort of lack of confidence that you would have as a child. And that's the true arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would be ashamed if I've been found doing so. Now that I'm 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. And does that not describe Susan to a T? I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race to the silliest time of one's life as quick as she can, and then to stop being there as long as she can. This is like the distraction, becoming distracted in material things. She's a material girl, if you will. But at heart, the issue is this. She doesn't even believe that Narnia exists. She has physically been to Narnia, lived there for years. She's been there even twice. and not just herself, but others close to her. This is a reality that she's denying for fear of being seen as a child. This is someone who is deeply unconfident and so deny reality. But there is hope, right? The story is not actually over for Susan. Yes, C.S. Lewis is dead. He's not going to write any more books. There were 7 that he wrote, and Susan didn't end up there. But Susan is not dead. All the others are in Narnia Heaven because they were on a train and it crashed. Spoilers. But Susan was not on that train. The Neil Gaiman concern is that's rather horrific for her to go through. And, fair. I don't think it's that sort of story where you kind of go through that sort of implication of things, but it's a fair critique, I suppose. Nonetheless, there is hope for Susan. She's not permanently out. She could recognize and realize that she's convinced herself of a lie, that what Narnia was real, is real, and not simply a childhood pencil game. So to conclude, the issue with Susan is not her interest in boys. That's incidental. The issue is, does she even believe that Narnia exists, or that it's all fake? She has become the new Edmund, denying what she knows exists. And she has an arrested development view of what an adult is. She has not grown up. That's the problem. So that's my first video of Elves and Droids. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to do probably a few more on Narnia before branching out in various other secondary worlds. Hope to see you again, and read some books.